Hi, welcome back to Engine Shop Joe. I wanted to take a look at this particular scenario that we had with an L9, and it was a newer L9. And the reason I wanted to look at it is it had injector faults, and it had fuel actuator faults, and it had a fault that the ECM said that the rail dump valve was opening, or the rail overpressure valve was opening. So it had quite a few fault codes that some were related, some were unrelated, but a lot of them were active. So when they're active, you have to deal with them. You just can't kind of push them under the table and forget them. So let's take a look at what the faults were, and then we'll talk about this tonight on Engine Shop Joe. Thanks for joining me. Don't forget to subscribe. So here we go. This is our list of faults. You can see on the far right that the oldest fault on the list is 1 hour and 53 minutes old, and that's the water and fuel sensor. It's inactive now. But we've got kind of two groups of faults here. So we've got the top two blue ones, 272 and 4691, and that is engine fuel pump pressurizing assembly, which is another name for the fueling actuator on the high pressure pump. That's active. It's got an open circuit. And then we've got the injector metering rail cranking pressure. The data was valid but below the normal operating range. If you look at the timestamps, those aren't very close together, but they are related because they're both fuel pressure related faults. Then down on the bottom, we've got 4 different faults on engine misfire for certain cylinder numbers and then multiple cylinders. So we're going to kind of take a look at these one at a time here. So first we're going to deal with those bottom faults that are related to engine misfires. And do you remember in an earlier video I said the way that the engine or ECM knows if a cylinder is misfiring is by it looks for spikes in exhaust gas pressure when the exhaust valve's open, because it knows that. And if you're at full throttle with a lot of boost and it's really fueling, it expects to see bigger pulses than smaller ones. Well, in this case, we went and took a look at the exhaust gas pressure sensor, and it didn't have any faults on it, but it was reading out of range. So we replaced that, and those faults ended up going inactive after we replaced that sensor and ran it. Then we had to go back up and deal with our other 2 faults. So next, let's look at fault code 4691, engine injector metering rail cranking pressure. Data valid but below normal operating range. So that's before it starts. While it's cranking, it's got to build rail, and it wasn't. Well, what had happened was they had done a service on the engine, and they were trying to start it, and they had some trouble getting air out of the system, and that's why we had the 4691. We noticed there was new filters on the engine, and we went and started asking, because a lot of times these units come down to us from either another shop, and the shops are very close together, so they just drive it down the road if there's a problem with it, or have us go up and take a look at it. And if you look, the 4691 happened almost 2 hours ago, so it was the oldest fault on this list, barring the one on the bottom, which was just water and fuel sensor problem. So that was the reason for the 4691. So now we see up at the top, we've got a inactive fault for the injector metering rail pressure to sensor circuit voltage above normal shorted high, and one, they're almost the exact same timestamp. And the reason for that was someone had unplugged that for a moment while the key was on, and then plugged it back in. So they were checking for corrosion or tarnishing on the leads inside of the pigtail. So that explained those 2 faults, and those were off of our plate. Now, the faults that really bother me on here, or the ones that I'm kind of concerned about, are, and they tie together, is 3741, which is basically the ECM knows that the rail pressure got so high that the rail relief valve opened. And it knows that by the pressure that it sees on the rail pressure sensor, because that pressure will go up over a calibrated value or maximum allowed value, and then it will dump very quickly. So it knows that that opened, and it logged fault 3741. And then we have 559, 14 counts of rail pressure below moderately severe. And that's been an hour or so, and I think the filters again were changed to address that, but that could have been caused by something else. And then we've got 272, engine fuel pump pressurizing assembly circuit, voltage above normal or shorted to high source. So let's talk about that a minute. That ended up being an actuator and a pressurizing assembly circuit. That is the actuator, the electric actuator. It had a shorted coil inside of it. When it was cold, it was okay. When it got hot, it was shorting. And so the ECM was having trouble controlling rail pressure with that failed actuator. And at one point, it actually the coil did go open, but then again, it would come back and the circuit would work again. So that was the reason that we had the 559 faults, and the reason that we had the 272 fault, and the reason that we had the 3741 fault. And so here we picked apart all these faults, and at the end of the day, they all make sense, and they were all corrected. And when you first look at this, it's almost overwhelming. But remember to just take things in blocks, fix the easiest thing first, or what makes sense first, and then go from there. Now, we did take a look at the calibration revision sheet. This is what it looks like. And we didn't really see anything that addressed the faults that we were dealing with currently. And the ECM had the current release calibration in it. So that was not going to help us out, updating the ECM calibration in this case. Now, I wanted you to see this 3741 possible causes for this fault. High fuel drain line restriction, a leaky or sticky fuel pump actuator, air in the fuel, a plugged fuel pump actuator mounting adapter. This fault indicates that fuel rail pressure was high enough to open the fuel rail pressure relief valve. So it's important to know that the actuator can have an electrical problem, and they also can wear, and then they can't do the job they're supposed to do. We have fixed many fuel pressure faults by changing the actuator. The right way to do it is to do the flow checks and then go through, and that'll be your last thing you do is replace the actuator, because all the flows are in line. Air in the fuel can cause the overpressure because you're compressing that fuel so much that you're also compressing the air with it. And then the pump actuator mounting adapter is that aluminum block that we talked about in an earlier video that has the check valves and the screen in it that's not cleanable. And if that plugs up, it affects the return. If the fuel can't return out of that pump head, it's going to go to the pumping chambers and end up in the rail, and you're going to have overpressure. So those are some of the common things that can cause problems with fuel pressure. Last here is a block diagram of the fuel system on the engine we're talking about. On the top right, you can see that green rectangle, and that is the rail pressure relief valve that dumps fuel back into the drain manifold. And you can see In the center, you've got your 5-micron fuel filter, and just to the left is the actuator. And it's got an air bleed orifice in that aluminum housing. And the actuator controls how much fuel gets into those pumping chambers. So if it doesn't function right, then you're going to have problems controlling your rail pressure. Thanks for joining me on Engine Shop Joe, and we'll see you next time.